On a Friday night, 15-year-old Marie Davis stayed over at her close friend's house in Christchurch, New Zealand. The next afternoon, Saturday, her friend and her friend's mother dropped Marie back at her family home in the suburb of Papanui. It was 6 p.m. That was the last confirmed physical sighting of Marie Davis. Marie's mother, Janet, had traveled out of town to visit relatives. It was her first trip away from her two daughters. Marie's older sister, Amy, had also gone out for the evening. Marie was home alone. She had a close friend living nearby and stayed in contact with her sister throughout the night. Everyone knew Marie was by herself, and there were no concerns. Marie was not the kind of teenager who went to parties. She was nearly 16, but she preferred staying home with her music, her computer, or a book. She had decided to clean the house to make it nice for her mother's return. She had never stayed home alone before, and she seemed to enjoy the independence. Janet was scheduled to fly back the following morning, Sunday. The plan was for Amy to meet Marie at home at 8 a.m. before they went together to welcome their mother at the airport. But when Amy arrived, the door was locked, the curtains and windows were closed. There was no sign of Marie. The house was secured as though Marie had left and tidied up before going somewhere. Amy tried calling her sister. Marie did not answer. She called Marie's friends. None of them knew where she was. Marie never came home. She never answered her phone. Janet landed at the airport, and Amy was there waiting with the mother of Marie's close friend. Janet saw Amy crying. For a moment, she thought Amy had simply missed her. But then Amy told her that Marie was missing and no one had any idea where she was. It was a nightmare. Missing person reports are filed every day, and most people are located quickly, especially with cell phones. But this case felt different from the start. Marie had never gone missing before. She and her mother and sister were extremely close. Marie's father had died when she was 3, so the bond between the three of them was strong. Marie also had very close friends, and for her not to be in contact with any of them was significant. The next morning, investigators entered the house with staff members to search for clues. They looked for a note, any sign that Marie had left a message explaining where she had gone. They also checked for signs of forced entry or disturbance. There were none. But several items were missing. Some beading materials Marie had been working on were gone. Most importantly, her wallet, her phone, and the house keys were missing. Marie always carried a green satchel bag with her phone, a little bit of makeup, and other personal items. She never went anywhere without it. That bag was gone. It seemed possible that she had simply left on her own. Investigators began gathering facts. They spoke to Marie's friends and teachers at her school. Marie enjoyed school. She had very good friends there. She was deeply interested in art and music. She was quiet and reserved. She loved drawing and was very talented. She would spend hours with a sketchbook. There was nothing in her background to suggest she would run away or that she was unhappy. Officers went door to door, conducting what is called an area canvass. Most people in the neighborhood knew Marie. Nothing unusual came up. Marie did not have access to a car, and it seemed unlikely she had caught a bus. CCTV footage was reviewed, but there were many blanks. Where was Marie? Why didn't she answer her phone? How could a 15-year-old just disappear? Investigators analyzed Marie's phone data to see if she had been texting friends or if the data revealed where she might have gone. On Saturday night, the data showed Marie was home. She had very minimal activity on her phone. She texted one of her close friends at 8:20 p.m. After that, she did not use her phone for the rest of the night. The next morning, Sunday, around 8:15 a.m., Marie received a text message from one of her sister's friends. About 7 minutes later, Marie received a phone call. Marie did not respond to the text or answer the call, which was strange. What stood out was that the text message at 8:15 a.m. registered in the Belfast area just north of Christchurch. 7 minutes later, when the phone call came in, the phone was registering in the Kiapoi area even further north. Marie's phone, or someone carrying it, was clearly traveling in a northerly direction away from Christchurch. This was the first time anything belonging to Marie led investigators away from her home. Search and rescue teams were deployed to the area. Calculations based on cell phone tower locations focused the search on Stewart's Gully, a rural area near Kiapoi, about a 20-minute drive north of Marie's home. The location sat on the edge of the Wamakariri River. Some bedding material was missing from the Davis home, so searchers had a list of items to look for, along with a description of the clothing Marie was probably wearing. On the first day, 6 teams of 3 people were in the field, along with 3 dog handlers and their assistants. About 24 people searched that day. The area was massive, all rural, with plantation forest and scrub bush. It seemed like looking for a needle in a haystack, but the search had to begin somewhere. 5 days passed with no sign of Marie. Searchers continued combing the vast land area near the river. Officers looked for other leads. As time went on, the situation became disturbing. There was still no contact with Marie. The longer she remained missing, the greater the fears grew. Forensic scientists were called in to examine the family home. Ideally, a crime scene is fresh with no disturbance after the event. But several days had passed, and people had been in and out of the house. Certain types of evidence, such as footwear analysis, were no longer viable. Forensic examiners wore full-body suits, gloves, and booties to avoid contamination. They looked for evidence of an assault. Blood would be the first thing to search for. They worked through the house room by room with a bright light. The light illuminated the scene and helped visualize any blood staining. 2 small areas of blood staining were found in one corner of Marie's bedroom, the corner furthest from the door. A chemical test confirmed it was blood, but the stains were quite small, only several millimeters in size. The second area was in the study, a small room off the lounge. The study had a computer and an upholstered chair. Blood staining was found on the floor near the chair, on the back of the chair in one corner and on one of the arms. The blood staining on the back of the chair was a reasonable size, quite light in color, maybe 20 to 30 millimeters overall. The blood stains on the arm of the chair were small, around 5 to 6 millimeters. The stain on the floor was quite light and close to the color of the timber. It would have been difficult to see without a bright light. In the dim lighting of the small room, it might not have been visible at all. The blood within the study and the small stains in Marie's room were the only blood found in the house. There was no other blood to suggest someone had a bleed. Although there was not much, the blood seemed unusual. Marie spent a lot of time in the study. The presence of blood in that room appeared significant. Investigators had to consider the possibility of a sexual attack. The forensic team screened the house for semen. Unlike blood, semen is not visible. The way to detect it is by testing for an enzyme present in high quantities in semen called acid phosphatase. The detection process begins by spraying an area with water. Damp paper is then applied to draw out any enzyme. The test area is marked, the paper is removed, and a chemical reagent is painted on it. If semen is present, the paper turns purple within 15 to 20 seconds. No semen was found on any floor areas within the house. The computer in the study, which Marie often used to upload photographs and listen to music, was forensically examined. Marie had been using the computer until just after 3 p.m. on Saturday. A song was loaded at that time. That song played 238 times without any further interaction until approximately 6:30 a.m. the next morning, when there was an attempt to shut down the computer. Normally, the computer was never shut down. The family typically left it running. This was an unusual event. It raised the obvious question of whether someone else had been in the house. Further phone data was analyzed, including landline calls in and out of the Davis home. On Saturday night, around 10 past 8 p.m., a phone call came into the house. The call lasted about 46 seconds, relatively short. The call had come from the home of Marie's close friend, the same friend whose house Marie had stayed at the previous night. The call stood out. It was a landline call, which was unusual. Most 15-year-olds use text messages. The nature of the phone call seemed very unusual. After speaking to people at that address, it became clear that Marie's friend and the friend's mother were both at a barbecue that evening. The only other person who lived at the address was the uncle of Marie's friend. The uncle was interviewed and provided a statement. He explained that he was out with friends that evening and had not made the phone call. The question remained, who made that call and what was it about? Media and public interest was running high. Hundreds of calls were coming in with potential leads and information. Late one evening, An officer at the station received a call from a man whose sons had been riding trail bikes down by the Wamakuriri River earlier that day. They had noticed something in the water that looked like bedding. They had poked at it. The man's daughter had seen the news that night about Marie being missing. The sighting was at a location about 9 kilometers upstream from the original search site. Things are often dumped in isolated locations, but because searchers had already been in the area, and because it was a likely location, the lead seemed promising. It was a cold night, and the river level was higher than normal. The river flow was quite swift. When search teams arrived at the location, the informant pointed out where the bedding was. One of the searchers went out and pulled 2 sheets from the water. The sheets were snagged against a log. Then the searcher saw something turquoise colored in the water. He reached out and picked it up. It was a bra. He handed it back. Then he saw a brown shape lying in the water. It was quite stuck, so he tied it off to a rock on the side of the bank. The dive squad was called in to search the area once it was daylight. The next morning, the dive squad recovered the blanket that had been tied off. It had a couple of big boulders dropped on top of it, making it difficult to remove. They also recovered a wallet in the water. They retrieved some lengths of rope as well. In all, 15 items of interest were found. Some of the bedding, the bra, and the wallet were identified as belonging to Marie. That was a turning point. The items had to be part of what happened to her somewhere around that river. Even more staff were deployed to the area in the hope of locating what was now believed to be Marie's body. All the material submitted was very damp. Before examination, it had to be dried, then sampled and examined. Any item submerged for a long period of time in water loses a lot of evidential value. Trace DNA material is lost, semen analysis is not viable, bloodstains may be diluted. Within the bedding, a couple of small bloodstains were found, sampled and sent for DNA analysis. Hairs were also recovered. Could they be Marie's hair, or could DNA analysis establish who they came from? There were also 2 items of yellow rope recovered. Within one of those items, there was a small section of what looked like a disposable glove attached to it. The knot in the rope was undone, and DNA swabbing was done on the material underneath the knot, just in case the area under the knot had been preserved enough to recover DNA from skin cells deposited from handling. No DNA could be found on the rope samples or the bloodstains, but after extensive analysis, 2 hairs were linked to Marie Davis. The bra was examined as well. The hook on the clasp had been severely bent back, which indicated that some force may have been applied while the bra was still being worn, or while the clasp was still attached. Investigators needed to determine who made the last landline call to Marie from her friend's house. Everyone who lived there claimed to be out. Someone had to have made that call. The possibility that someone broke into the house just to make a phone call seemed ridiculous. During the inquiry, various people and options were examined. The phone call that came in that night heightened awareness around the uncle, Dean Cameron. Dean Cameron claimed to be out with friends. His phone data was analyzed to see where he had been on Saturday and, most importantly, Sunday morning. Once Dean Cameron's phone data was obtained, it became clear he had been traveling around Christchurch City earlier in the evening, from about 4 p.m. through to about 6 p.m. with friends. On Saturday night, Dean Cameron started receiving phone calls on his cell phone from the friends he had been with earlier in the evening. That was just after 10 past 8 p.m., which indicated he was not with his friends. Otherwise, they would not have been calling him. Around 10 past 8 p.m. When he was receiving those calls, he was in the area of the cell tower closest to his home address. About half an hour later, his phone appeared to have moved to a different cell site, the cell site closest to Marie's address. Dean Cameron's cell phone was in the area of Marie's house for quite some time, about half an hour. The last time he received any traffic on his cell phone was about 9:30 p.m. on Saturday night. There was no activity from then until about 10 a.m. The next morning, when he appeared to be in the vicinity of Kiapoi, the same area Marie's cell phone had been in that morning. When people become a person of interest, their movements are examined. The goal is to establish whether the movements of the missing person and the person of interest cross over. Dean Cameron's movements started to interlink with Marie Davis, close to her home address. A search of the house where Dean Cameron lived was conducted. Marie had been in the house the day before her disappearance, which meant finding her DNA would be expected and easily explained in much of the house. The focus was on the bedroom of the suspect. Investigators looked for blood staining within the room. Nothing of major significance was found, so no DNA analysis was done on anything from the room. But in the garage, several pieces of rope and latex gloves were found, similar to the rope and glove fragments found at the river. It seemed like a coincidence, but perhaps there was more to it. Dean Cameron had been identified as a person of interest. Latex gloves and sections of rope found at his house looked similar to those found at the river. Were they a scientific match? The rope analysis began with examining the rope's construction. The rope had 3 strands twisted together in what is called a Z-twist, where the diagonal lines on the rope resemble the letter Z. Each of those strands had diagonal lines going the other way, an S-twist. This is a common way rope is constructed. If the twist were the same direction, the rope would unravel. The number of strands in each section was counted. There were between 15 and 20 different strands. The 2 ropes could not be told apart on any of the testing. Chemical analysis identified that all the rope samples were made from polypropylene and matched in color. This provided support that the ropes were the same, but it was not conclusive evidence. This type of rope is quite common, and other types of rope available on the market would also match these samples. It provided a link, but a reasonably weak one. Latex gloves are also widely available. Small pieces of the gloves were attached to metal stubs and placed inside an electron scanning machine. An electron beam was fired at the latex sample. The atoms present were excited, emitting X-rays. A detector measured those X-rays, measuring the elements on the periodic table. For example, calcium peaks at about 3.9 electron volts. Sulfur is about 2.4. The instrument is very accurate at detecting the elements. Some smaller peaks also appeared. Potassium is something expected in latex gloves. Elemental composition differs between manufacturers and even between batches of gloves. At the suspect's address, there were 4 different types of latex gloves, but all were different from what was found at the scene. Out of the 5 gloves at the suspect's house, only 2 matched, showing a real variety. Investigators were interested in Dean Cameron's movements because phone data placed him at Kiapoi near the Waimakariri River on Sunday morning. He maintained he had not been at the river, and Marie had never been in his car. A potential breakthrough came when it was discovered that some sections of the river were monitored by security cameras. The cameras were not running. Dean Cameron's car was forensically examined for any links to Marie. Hairs were collected. There was no visual blood staining on the inside or outside of the vehicle. Semen analysis was done in case a sexual event had taken place in the car. No semen was recovered. Swabs were taken from door handles or anything that may have been touched. DNA analysis was done on a number of those swabs, but overall, there was nothing of significance from the vehicle. No evidence of Marie was found in the car. Samples of debris from the car were taken to see if they corresponded to soil from the river. Under the microscope, the largest pollen grains could probably be seen by the naked eye, but most could not. The focus was on things that are really small, less than 1/10 of a millimeter. Wind-dispersed pollen is common, but insect-dispersed pollen is what forensic scientists look for because it is deposited very locally, most within a meter or so of the plant. Another approach is to look for genetic abnormality. Analysis requires identifying up to 3,000 pollen grains per sample. The dominant pollen types from the river were pioneers, willows, and grass. Samples from the car contained those pollen types as well. There was nothing distinctive about the pollen from the river. Most pollen came from weeds and trees that grow all around Christchurch. It was disappointing. Unless you look, you will not find the critical clue that may be there. It was now 12 days since Marie went missing, and 2 days since her bra, wallet, and bedding from her home were discovered in the river. For the first week, or probably longer, Janet was in constant denial. She kept thinking Marie was somewhere else. She had to be somewhere else, but it was only wishful thinking. The Waimakariri River has a huge catchment. It extends all the way to Arthur's Pass. It has lots of feeders coming into it and is quite braided. meaning it is broken with lots of little branches. It changes as water comes down. When someone dies, they naturally sink to the bottom and generally will not go far. After a few days, depending on the water temperature, the body starts to decay, building up gas from bacteria. Then the body floats and starts drifting with the current. On the morning of the 17th, motorists driving to work had seen something in the water. A jet boat was brought in to check out the sighting. On the way back, Marie was found. She had started to float down and came to a braided section, a higher section of river flowing down into a lower section. She became beached on that downward part. She was still submerged, only a little bit out of the water. She was quite hard to see because she was covered with silt. She was naked. The most important step was to notify the family before anyone else. The grief and emotion around that moment is always difficult in any officer's career. Marie was no longer alive. Marie's body was taken from the river for a post-mortem and forensic examination. The hope was that science and forensic experts would assist in holding someone accountable. The pathologist could not confirm the cause of death. He could eliminate certain things, but not 100%. However, he could say it was not from natural causes. Possible causes included neck compression. Drowning could not be excluded. There was no sign of predation by eels or seagulls, which supported the view the body was wrapped up while in the water. Swabs were taken from Marie's body. The personal view of the forensic examiner was that results might be limited. The body had been submerged. They would have to get lucky to find anything useful. While looking at slides prepared from vaginal swabs, something became evident. There was semen present. Sperm cells could be seen. This could be quite interesting. A DNA expert was called into the lab to process the samples under ultra urgency. Notes indicated the number of spermatozoa seen on the slides. Those numbers were very low. They were present but scored as a rank of 1. The samples were not the best. Viewing confirmed a minimal number, especially when seen alongside other cells on the slide. It was a mixture of epithelial cells and spermatozoa. Epithelial cells are cells that line body orifices such as the mouth or genital tract. They appeared green like big green balloon. Then there were smaller oval-shaped red cells. Those were just the heads of spermatozoa. The tails break off relatively quickly. In this case, there would not have been any tails present. The minimal number was not the only issue. There was also the level of deterioration from being in the river for 12 days. Researching forensic archives for similar cases only emphasized how difficult the task would be. There were a couple of papers that looked at recovering DNA from bodies that had been submerged. One looked at recovering DNA from underneath fingernails from a body in a bathtub for a matter of hours, not days. Another was a case in the US where a body had been in a slow-moving creek and DNA had been recovered from a bite mark on the neck. Again, just a few hours. Nothing like the 12 days being looked at in this case. Dedicated staff worked for over 2 days to establish whether obtaining a DNA profile from the spermatozoa was even possible. Seeing the mixed DNA profile with quite a lot of information was quite satisfying, given the expectation on the sample was so low to start with. From that mixed DNA, a male profile was established. It gave a likelihood ratio of 5,000. Which converts to very strong scientific support that the male DNA component had originated from Dean Cameron, rather than a male in the general New Zealand population. Receiving that result was a bit of a moment of triumph, not only for the expert, but for all the staff. It was the satisfaction of knowing someone could be held accountable for such a disgusting and sad scenario of taking someone's life. The results from the bloodstains at the Davis home came through at virtually the same time. Small drops of blood in Marie's bedroom were hers, but in the study, bloodstains on the floor and on the armchair were strongly linked to Dean Cameron. After weeks of investigation, a case was building. Many regular users of the river reported seeing a silver sedan speeding along its banks on the Sunday morning Marie disappeared. Dean Cameron's car is a silver Mitsubishi. The speed of the vehicle on the riverbank, a stony road with dust going up, was unusual. Some of the betting items were identified as being from Dean Cameron's home and others from the home of one of his friends. Witnesses also reported a dramatic change in his behavior since Marie's disappearance. He spoke to a friend on about day 2 of Marie's disappearance, saying he was a suspect for the investigation, when at that time she was still a missing person, and there was no cause for him to have said that to someone. His friends and family described his behavior as paranoid and quite unusual. Dean Cameron had helped hand out flyers for missing Marie. He also attended her funeral. 4 days later, he was arrested and charged. Dean Cameron went to Marie's home address. He raped and murdered her. He took her body and dumped it in the Waimakariri River. He had overheard her talking about being home by herself on Saturday night. One of Marie's friends saw him listening from the kitchen. The phone call made by Dean Cameron to Marie may have indicated he was coming around. She knew him. That would suggest she led him into the house. Much is not known, including whether 15-year-old Marie fought back. There were no signs of struggle, but there was the telltale sign of Dean Cameron's blood at the house. Dean Cameron, age 39, was convicted of the rape and murder of Marie Davis. At sentencing, it was revealed he had previously been jailed for 4 years for sexual violation. He had been released 9 months before he attacked Marie Davis. He was sentenced to preventative detention with a minimum parole period of 19 years. Marie would have been 23 now. Janet learned to cope with it, though there will never be a time when she will not think about her. When going through Marie's things, Janet found a list of careers Marie was considering. Among them were police detective and forensic scientist. It was a high-profile case, quite tough at times with a lot of demands. It is always satisfying when something done in forensic science has some impact on the final outcome when it gets to court. Recovering spermatozoa from a body 12 days in a river is still one of the more surprising results. It is definitely memorable. There were times when the questions were what has happened and who has been involved. Conclusions could be drawn, but evidence was needed. For everyone involved, it was significant to hold someone accountable, but ultimately, it would have been better if it had not happened.